The security alert pinged on my phone at exactly 11:47 a.m. on a Saturday morning. Motion detected at pool gate camera 3. I was in my home office reviewing contracts when I pulled up the live feed and saw her, Margaret Thorne, self-appointed Queen of Sunset Ridge Estates, standing at my pool gate with what appeared to be a small army of entitled suburbanites behind her. Let me back up and explain how I ended up with the most surveilled backyard in the neighborhood and why Margaret Thorne thought she had the right to demand access to my private swimming pool. My name is David Chin and I'm what you might call startup money. Not the flashy kind that buys yachts, but the practical kind that buys a nice house in a gated community and hires lawyers when neighbors get out of line. 2 years ago, I'd moved to Sunset Ridge Estates specifically because I wanted privacy, security, and the kind of amenities that made working from home actually enjoyable. The house came with a beautiful backyard oasis, a custom-designed swimming pool with a spa, outdoor kitchen, and enough space to host small gatherings without feeling cramped. It also came with Margaret Thorne as a neighbor, though the realtor had failed to mention that particular hazard. Margaret had been the HOA president for 8 years, which in her mind apparently meant she was the unofficial mayor of our gated community. She had opinions about everything: the color of mailboxes, the height of grass, the appropriateness of garden gnomes, and most relevantly, who should have access to private amenities. The trouble started 3 months after I moved in, when Margaret knocked on my door with a clipboard and what she probably thought was a winning smile. "David," she'd said, barging past me into my living room like we were old friends, "I've been meaning to talk to you about community integration opportunities." Community integration? Yes. Your pool area would be perfect for HOA social events. We're thinking monthly pool parties, exercise classes, maybe even wedding receptions. I'd stared at her like she just suggested I donate my kidney. "Margaret, that's my private pool." "Well, yes, technically it's on your property, but community amenities should benefit the entire community." "It's not a community amenity. It's my backyard." "Don't be selfish, David. Property ownership comes with social responsibilities." That conversation had ended with Margaret huffing out of my house, muttering about antisocial behavior and missed opportunities for community building. I'd assumed that was the end of it. I was wrong. Over the next few months, Margaret had waged a passive-aggressive campaign to gain access to my pool. She'd organized HOA meetings where she discussed the underutilization of private amenities. She'd circulated petitions calling for community access to recreational facilities. She'd even had the audacity to suggest that large private pools should be subject to social impact assessments. None of it was legally binding, of course, but Margaret was persistent in the way that only retired people with too much time on their hands can be. Which is why I'd installed what my security company cheerfully called comprehensive perimeter monitoring, 8 high-definition cameras covering every angle of my property, motion sensors, and a recording system that would make the NSA jealous. My lawyer, Janet Morrison, had suggested the security upgrades after Margaret's third attempt to pressure me into hosting an impromptu community gathering in my backyard. "David," Janet had said, "people like Margaret don't give up easily. Document everything. If she escalates to actual harassment or trespassing, you'll need evidence." Janet had been right. And on this particular Saturday morning, Margaret was about to provide me with enough evidence to end her reign of suburban terror once and for all. I watched the security feed as Margaret rattled my pool gate like she was trying to break it down. Behind her stood 6 other residents, all dressed in swimwear and carrying pool accessories like they were arriving for a party I'd never agreed to host. My phone rang. "Janet Morrison." "David, are you watching your security feeds?" "Yes." "Margaret's at my pool gate with what looks like a lynch mob in swimsuits." "Perfect. Keep recording. Don't engage with them directly. Let them make their demands on camera. And if they try to force their way in, then they'll be trespassing on video, and we'll have enough evidence to get restraining orders against all of them." I switched my phone to speaker and pulled up all 8 camera angles on my computer monitors. Margaret's invasion was being documented from every conceivable angle in high-definition clarity. "Margaret Thorne." I called out through my home's intercom system. "You're on private property. Please leave." Margaret looked around trying to figure out where my voice was coming from, then spotted one of my security cameras and stared directly into it. "David Chin," she shouted like she was addressing a public rally. "Open this gate immediately. We have community pool privileges." "You have no such privileges. This is private property. We're invoking emergency HOA access rights." "There are no emergency HOA access rights to private pools, Margaret." "Well, there should be. It's 95 degrees outside, and the community pool is being repaired. And there it was. The Sunset Ridge Estates community pool, the actual community amenity that all residents had paid for and were entitled to use, was temporarily closed for maintenance. So Margaret had decided that my private pool should serve as the substitute. Margaret, the fact that the community pool is closed doesn't give you access to my pool. Don't be ridiculous. Community members shouldn't suffer because of your selfishness. One of the people behind Margaret, a man I recognized as Bob Patterson from 2 streets over, stepped forward and tried the gate handle. "Bob," I said through the intercom, "that's attempted trespassing." "We're not trespassing," Margaret declared. "We're asserting community rights." "You're asserting imaginary rights to private property." "These rights aren't imaginary. I'm calling the police." Janet's voice came through my phone speaker. "Let her call. Make sure everything's being recorded." Margaret pulled out her phone and dialed 911 with the dramatic flair of someone reporting a major crime. 911? "Yes, I need police immediately. We have a property owner who's denying emergency community access to essential amenities during a heat emergency." I had to admire her creativity. Margaret had just reframed her desire to use my pool as a public safety issue. "Yes, this is Margaret Thorne, president of the Sunset Ridge Estates HOA. The address is 1247 Maple Ridge Drive. A community member is denying access to essential cooling facilities during dangerous heat conditions." While Margaret gave the dispatcher her version of events, I called my property management company. "Steve, it's David Chin. I need you to check something for me. What are the exact terms of the pool maintenance agreement for the community pool?" "Let me check." "Okay, the community pool is scheduled for resurfacing and equipment replacement. It's been closed for 2 weeks and should reopen Monday." 2 weeks? And the HOA didn't arrange alternative accommodations. "Not our responsibility, David. The community pool maintenance is handled by the HOA board." So Margaret had known for 2 weeks that the community pool would be closed, and instead of arranging temporary alternatives like day passes to a local recreation center, she decided to simply commandeer my pool. 20 minutes later, 2 patrol cars pulled up to my house. Officers Williams and Chin, no relation, climbed out and approached Margaret's group, who were still clustered around my pool gate like protesters demanding entrance to a government building. "Good afternoon, folks," Officer Williams said. "We received a call about some kind of access dispute." Margaret rushed toward them like they were her personal cavalry. "Officers, thank goodness you're here. This man is denying community members access to essential cooling facilities during a dangerous heat emergency." Officer Chen looked around at Margaret's group, all of whom were clearly dressed for recreation rather than any kind of emergency. "Ma'am, could you explain what you mean by essential cooling facilities?" "The community pool." Margaret gestured dramatically toward my backyard. "Our community pool is temporarily closed, and this property owner is refusing to allow community members access to his private pool." The officers exchanged glances that suggested they'd heard some strange calls before, but this one was definitely making the list. "Ma'am," Officer Williams said carefully, "are you saying you want to use someone else's private pool?" "I'm saying that during a community emergency, property owners have social obligations." "Ma'am, wanting to go swimming on a hot day doesn't constitute a community emergency." That's when I decided to join the conversation. I came out of my house carrying a folder of documents and approached the group at my front gate. "Officers, I'm David Chin. I'm the homeowner Mrs. Thorne is harassing." "Mr. Chin," Officer Chin said, "Mrs. Thorne claims you're denying access to essential facilities." "Officers, Mrs. Thorne wants to use my private swimming pool because the community pool is temporarily closed for maintenance." "Your private pool?" "Yes, sir. The pool is in my backyard on my property, built at my expense and maintained by me." Officer Williams looked at Margaret. "Ma'am, are you asking to use this gentleman's private pool?" "I'm demanding community access to underutilized recreational facilities." "Ma'am, there's no legal requirement for someone to share their private pool." "Well, there should be. This is supposed to be a community." Bob Patterson, who had been conspicuously quiet during the police questioning, finally spoke up. "Officers, maybe we misunderstood the situation. We thought there might be some kind of community use agreement." "There's no agreement," I said. "There's never been an agreement. Mrs. Thorne simply decided she was entitled to use my pool." Margaret's face was turning an alarming shade of red. "This is discrimination against community members." "Ma'am," Officer Chin said patiently, "property owners have the right to decide who uses their private facilities. But we're neighbors. We live in the same community." "Ma'am, Living in the same neighborhood doesn't give you access to your neighbor's private property. That's when Margaret played what she apparently thought was her trump card. I have documents, she declared, pulling a folder from her beach bag. HOA bylaws that clearly establish community access rights. She handed Officer Williams a thick stack of papers that appeared to be the Sunset Ridge Estates HOA governing documents. Officer Williams flipped through the papers with the expression of someone who'd rather be anywhere else. Ma'am, I'm not seeing anything here about private pool access. Page 47. Community amenity sharing during emergencies. Officer Williams found page 47 and read it carefully. Ma'am, this section is about access to common areas during maintenance. It doesn't mention private pools. It says community amenities. It says common area amenities. Mr. Chen's pool isn't a common area. Margaret snatched the papers back and rifled through them frantically. There has to be something. Community spirit provisions. Neighbor assistance requirements. Mrs. Thorne, I said, even if there were such provisions, they wouldn't override property rights. Property rights. Margaret spat the words like they tasted bad. What about community rights? What about social obligations? Ma'am, Officer Chen said, we need to wrap this up. Is there any legal basis for your claim to use Mr. Chen's pool? Margaret looked around at her fellow would-be pool crashers, all of whom were suddenly finding the pavement very interesting. This is about more than legal technicalities. This is about being good neighbors. Mrs. Thorne, I said, good neighbors don't demand access to each other's private property. Good neighbors respect boundaries. I'm not leaving until you grant us access. Officer Williams stepped forward. Ma'am, you're on private property without permission. If you don't leave voluntarily, you'll be arrested for trespassing. That's when Margaret made the mistake that would end her HOA presidency and result in more legal trouble than she could have imagined. I'm not trespassing. I'm the HOA president. I have authority over community standards and property use. Ma'am, I said, being HOA president doesn't give you authority over private property. It gives me authority over community members who aren't following community spirit. Mrs. Thorne, Officer Chin said, you need to leave this property now. I'm calling my lawyer. Margaret declared, pulling out her phone again. We'll see about these so-called property rights. As Margaret dialed her lawyer, I pulled out my own phone and called Janet Morrison. Janet, it's David. The police are here and Margaret's calling her lawyer. She's refusing to leave my property. Perfect. Are you getting all this on camera? 8 different angles in high definition. Excellent. Tell the officers you want to press charges for trespassing and harassment. I hung up and turned to Officer Williams. Officers, I'd like to press charges for trespassing and harassment. Mr. Chin, are you sure? These are your neighbors. Officer, Mrs. Thorne has been harassing me for months about access to my pool. Today she brought a group to my property gate and refused to leave when asked. This isn't a neighborly disagreement, it's a pattern of harassment. Margaret, who had apparently finished her call with her lawyer, overheard my conversation with the police. Harassment? I'm the one being harassed. This man is violating community standards and neighbor obligations. Mrs. Thorne, Officer Chin said, what specific community standards is Mr. Chin violating? Margaret waved her hands vaguely. Antisocial behavior. Failure to participate in community activities. Hoarding of recreational resources. Ma'am, none of those are legal violations. Well, they should be. That's when Bob Patterson finally found his spine and distanced himself from Margaret's sinking ship. Officers, I think there's been a misunderstanding. Mrs. Thorne told us that Mr. Chin had agreed to let the community use his pool while ours was being repaired. I stared at Bob in disbelief. I never agreed to any such thing. But Margaret said you discussed it at the last HOA meeting. Bob, I haven't attended an HOA meeting in 6 months. And I've never discussed sharing my pool with anyone. The realization that Margaret had lied to them was dawning on the faces of the other pool party crashers. One by one they began making excuses and heading back to their cars. Wait. Margaret called after them. Don't let him divide us. We have community solidarity. But her army of entitled neighbors had already begun their retreat, leaving Margaret standing alone at my gate like a general whose troops had deserted. Officer Williams finished writing in his citation book and handed Margaret a ticket. Ma'am, you're being cited for trespassing. You have 30 days to pay the fine or contest it in court. This is ridiculous. I'm the HOA president. Ma'am, being HOA president doesn't exempt you from trespassing laws. I'm going to file a complaint against both of you officers. That's your right, ma'am. You can call the station and speak to a supervisor. As the police cars pulled away, Margaret stood alone in my driveway, holding her trespassing citation and staring at my security cameras like they had personally wronged her. This isn't over, David Chin, she called out. I'm going to research your property records. I'm going to check every building permit. I'm going to find violations. Mrs. Thorne, I said through my intercom, you're still on my property. Please leave. I'm going to call the county, the state, the federal government. Mrs. Thorne, please leave my property before I call the police back. Finally, Margaret climbed into her pristine white Lexus and roared off, probably to spend the rest of her weekend researching property law and making angry phone calls to anyone who would listen. I spent the afternoon reviewing the security footage with Janet Morrison, who had driven over to assess our legal position. David, she said, watching Margaret's gate-rattling performance on my high-definition monitors, this is the best documented case of neighbor harassment I've seen in 20 years of practice. What are our options? We can file for a restraining order based on the harassment pattern. We can sue for intentional infliction of emotional distress. And if she follows through on her threats to file false complaints against you, we can add abuse of process to the list. What about the other neighbors? The ones who came with her? They were clearly misled about having permission to use your pool. Once they realized Margaret had lied to them, they left voluntarily. I don't see any reason to pursue action against them. The aftermath unfolded exactly as Janet had predicted. Margaret spent the following week filing complaints with every government agency she could think of. Building and Safety came out to inspect my pool permits, all in perfect order. The fire department checked my outdoor kitchen for code violations, none found. Environmental Health investigated my pool chemicals, properly maintained and documented. Each inspection cost the county money and taxpayer resources, all so Margaret could try to prove that my private pool somehow violated someone's rights somehow. The final nail in Margaret's coffin came from an unexpected source, her own HOA board. 3 days after the pool incident, I received a call from Tom Richardson, the vice president of the Sunset Ridge Estates HOA. David, I owe you an apology. The board has been reviewing Margaret's actions over the past few months, and we're appalled by her behavior. Tom, I appreciate that. We're calling for her resignation as president. What she did to you was completely inappropriate and potentially opens the HOA to legal liability. Legal liability? If she's making official-sounding demands on behalf of the HOA that have no legal basis, she could expose the association to lawsuits. The board can't allow that. 2 weeks later, I received an invitation to an emergency HOA meeting where Margaret Thorne would face a vote of no confidence. I decided to attend, partly out of curiosity and partly because Janet thought it would be good for the community to see that I wasn't the antisocial villain Margaret had painted me as. The community center was packed with residents who looked like they'd just discovered their HOA president had been conducting foreign policy without authorization. Margaret sat at the front table looking like someone who'd been asked to explain why gravity was optional. Tom Richardson called the meeting to order and explained the situation to the assembled residents. As many of you know, there was an incident 2 weeks ago where Mrs. Thorne, acting as HOA president, attempted to gain access to Mr. Chen's private pool for a community gathering. This action was taken without board approval and had no legal basis. The room erupted in questions and comments. What do you mean no legal basis? I thought we had community access rights. Margaret told us it was approved. Tom raised his hand for silence. The HOA board has no authority over private property owned by individual residents. Mrs. Thorne's actions were taken unilaterally and do not represent the position of this association. Margaret finally found her voice. I was protecting community interests. David Chin has been antisocial and uncooperative since the day he moved here. Mrs. Thorne, Tom said, being antisocial isn't a violation of HOA covenants. And even if it were, that wouldn't give us authority over private property. But the community pool was closed. People needed access to cooling facilities. Mrs. Thorne, the community pool closure was planned maintenance that you, as president, should have anticipated. Arranging alternative accommodations was your responsibility, not Mr. Chen's. A woman near the back of the room raised her hand. Are you saying Margaret lied to us about having permission to use David's pool? Tom looked uncomfortable. I'm saying Mrs. Thorne made representations about community access rights that had no basis in our governing documents or in law. The vote of no confidence was unanimous except for Margaret's own vote. She was removed as president effective immediately, and Tom Richardson was elected as interim president until the next regular election. As the meeting wound down, several neighbors approached me to apologize for Margaret's behavior and for being misled into thinking they had rights to my pool. "David," said Sarah Martinez from down the street, "I'm so sorry about all this. Margaret told us you'd agreed to share your pool during the maintenance period. Sarah, you couldn't have known she was lying. Still, we should have asked you directly instead of just showing up at your gate. No harm done." Well, except to Margaret. As I drove home that evening, I reflected on one of the stranger conflicts I'd experienced since moving to Sunset Ridge Estates. Margaret Thorne had convinced herself that being HOA president gave her authority over private property, and when reality refused to cooperate with her delusions, she doubled down by involving the police and government agencies. But the most satisfying part wasn't Margaret's downfall, it was watching a community learn the difference between community property and private property, between HOA authority and property rights, between neighborhood cooperation and entitled demands. My security cameras had captured every moment of Margaret's harassment campaign, providing the evidence needed to hold her accountable for her actions. My lawyer had been ready with legal remedies that protected my rights while educating the community about boundaries. And my pool? It remained private, just as it had always been, surrounded by neighbors who now understood that good fences, and good property law, make good neighbors. The next weekend, I hosted a small pool party for the neighbors who'd apologized for Margaret's behavior. It was voluntary, it was by invitation, and it was a reminder that sharing is something you choose to do, not something entitled people can demand you do. Margaret Thorne moved out of Sunset Ridge Estates 3 months later, selling her house to a lovely retired couple who understood that private property means private property, regardless of how hot it gets outside.